Having recently have done a lot of house shopping, house hunting, I know that there are many things to consider on the journey. Perhaps things like location of a home, what kind of kitchen is in the home, cabinets, does it have updated windows, does it not have updated windows, how many bedrooms does it have, how many bathrooms does it have, what's the layout of the house, does it have carpet, does it have hardwoods, does it have a basement, is the basement finished, is it unfinished, how old is the furnace, how old is the AC, and the list goes on and on and on. And yet, there is one thing that is always a deal breaker if you see it as a major issue. I shouldn't say always, but almost always a deal breaker, because all of the things that I just mentioned are pretty well cosmetic. To some extent, you can change the layout of a house. You can update the furnace or the air conditioner. You can paint the walls. You can update the kitchen. You can add a bedroom or a bathroom here and there. But if you go to a house and it looks something like this, there it goes. If it has, even if it's pretty looking, we'll just blame this on Todd. He's the tech guy around here. No, if you know that when you're looking at a house, even if it's beautiful, even if it looks perfectly right on the outside, if there is an issue with the foundation, you know that as life goes on, my goodness, it's on the fritz. Let's just get this all settled before we move on here. There we go. We'll stop there. But you know that if a house, even if it looks gorgeous on the outside, if there's an issue with the foundation, that house over time is going to crumble and probably at some point completely collapse. It certainly isn't going to be useful. And yet that truth doesn't just apply to a home. It doesn't just apply to a house, but the same thing happens in life. That if a life is built on a shaky or an unstable foundation, as time goes on, it's going to begin to crumble, and eventually it will probably crash. On the contrary, if life is built on a solid rock of a foundation, the house will not only be beautiful on the outside, but it's going to stand firm when the storms come, when things of life happen. That life will stand firm. So the question for us to ask right up front is, on what foundation are you building the home of your life? If you were to think on your previous week, and you look at the days, and you're to look at the weeks past, week in and week out, if you are really wrestling with what you are building your life on, what kind of foundation is it? And though I haven't lived as long as some of you, in my 28 years of life, I know that there have been different seasons where I have begun to build my life on a shaky foundation, and as I try to pursue worldly ambitions or worldly dreams, it doesn't take very long for a storm to come and for my life to begin to crumble. And after a number of years of ministry and brushing shoulders with a lot of different people, I know that many people are striving for ways of this world, and they're building their life on worldly foundations. And when the storms of life come, their lives begin to crumble. And it can even become heartbreaking when it completely crashes. We've been going through this series titled His Story, and we're on week number 5, where we've divided up chapter 4 in our His Story book into 2 weeks, because we're striving to cover Jesus' revolutionary teaching. But you know that takes up a lot of white space within Scripture. Jesus had a lot of things to say. He had a lot of radical teachings. And we looked at some of his confrontation with the Pharisees last week, and the traditions and the barriers that they were placing in front of people that were trying to come to him. And this week we have the small task of covering the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, 6, and 7, and Luke chapter 6, and we're going to do so in 1 week. So buckle up, here we go. But so far, Jesus has called disciples to himself. And it was such a big deal that he had actually retreated and spent the night praying as he formalizes these guys' names. He prayed about who they are. He formalized it. In fact, our history book says this. Now he makes it official. Formally naming the 12 disciples is so monumental that Jesus spent the night praying over it. Now, Jesus and his 12 are ready to get to work, but first, he must do some heavy-duty teaching. And that heavy-duty teaching that we're going to look at today is what we now call the Sermon on the Mount. So far, Jesus has been preaching, repent for the kingdom of heaven is near. It is right here at hand, and this is the moment that the Jewish people have been looking for all throughout biblical history. They've been longing for the one that was going to restore the kingdom, the long-awaited king. And as Jesus preaches, repent for the kingdom of heaven is at hand, he's gradually revealing his identity as the king of that kingdom. Later on, he's going to say, my kingdom is not of this world, but it is of another world. And as we're going to see within the Sermon on the Mount, that is certainly true. Because what the Sermon on the Mount does, and what Jesus does here, is he paints the picture of what his kingdom citizens are supposed to look like. There is nothing within the Sermon on the Mount that remains status quo. There is nothing that isn't countercultural. The whole thing flies in the face of the ways of this world. If you were to watch the commercials on your television and you were to open up the Sermon on the Mount simultaneously, there wouldn't be anything that was consistent between the two. This entire sermon and what Jesus expects of his kingdom citizens is countercultural. This sermon describes what human life is supposed to be like, what it's supposed to look like, under the complete rule of God. And if you're under the complete rule of God, you are a kingdom citizen. There's a few large-scale observations of what kingdom citizens look like in the Sermon on the Mount. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at the bookends. We're actually going to begin with Matthew chapter 5, verses 3 through 16. And then we're going to flip quickly over to Luke chapter 6 and see the end of the Sermon on the Mount, or Matthew 7. Same account. We're just going to look at it from two different perspectives. So first, the first significant observation that we see in Matthew chapter 5, verses 3 through 12, is that kingdom citizens have a unique character. They look very different than people of this world. And so I'm going to read the Beatitudes, chapter 5, verses 3 through 12. And then we're going to go through really quickly, and we're just going to kind of give a synopsis of each one of those Beatitudes so that way we can get a good grasp of what Jesus is trying to tell us as kingdom citizens, what our character is supposed to be like. So first, let's read it through. Jesus said this, blessed are the poor in spirit. Actually, let me correct that. I'm going to say blessed, not blessed. It's just a habit. Blessed. Hope you're okay with that. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. D.A. Carson writes, the more I read these three chapters, Matthew 5, 6, and 7, the more I am drawn to them and shamed by them. Their brilliant light draws me like a moth to a spotlight, but the light is so bright that it sears and burns. The Beatitudes just give us a glimpse of that. We read these instructions, these descriptions of a kingdom citizen, and we're drawn to them. We like Jesus' teaching. And yet, as attractive as they are, when we really take a closer look, when we really get up close to them and we reflect on our lives, it sears and burns because we're convicted by the way that we don't quite measure up. We're convicted of our own lives. And it can be tempting as we look at these 8 Beatitudes to begin to say that, well, this one applies to me, or this one applies to me, or I need to focus on this one or that one. But the reality is that all 8 of these Beatitudes are a description of what a kingdom citizen is to be like. Not some. It's not like a spiritual gift where some are you and some aren't you. All 8 of these are describing what a kingdom citizen is to be like. And it's also tempting to say, well, this passage is referring to the Christian elite. These are the best of the best. I can't be like them. And we just try to uplift them and say, well, that's for them. I can't measure up. But that's not what this text is saying. All of these Beatitudes are descriptions of what all kingdom citizens are to be like. And Jesus starts each one of these Beatitudes with the word blessed, which carries the idea of fulfillment. The ideas of a little bit of results and rewards, and the ideas of happiness, because we know that when you're living life fulfilled, there is an element of happiness. Now, if we were to interpret that word blessed by happy, that would that would be misleading. But there is a level of joy and fulfillment, certainly fulfillment, that comes along with this word. For as John Stott says, nobody knows better than our Creator how we may become truly human beings. He made us. He knows how we work best. It is through obeying His moral laws that we find and fulfill ourselves. Jesus is showing us how we were designed to live. He's teaching us the way God's original intent for His kingdom citizens. God has always been in the business, all the way throughout biblical history, of setting apart people for Himself. He calls them holy, which simply means set apart. They look different. They look unique. And that's certainly what we see here within the Beatitudes. Let's just walk through them quickly. Starting in verse 3, the poor in spirit. This is an Old Testament imagery used for a poor man. For a poor man was somebody who would have to rely on God. They looked to God for deliverance, for salvation, but they also were humble before God because they recognized they didn't deserve anything from God. Jesus isn't referring here when He says poor in spirit. He's not describing how people should be depressed. He's not telling us that we need to be self-loathing. But rather, what He's referring to is the acknowledgement of the truth that we're helpless before a holy God. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. So simply stated, the poor in spirit are people who recognize that they're unworthy before God. To be a part of the kingdom, you must recognize your need for Him. So as we see different language about being rich, it's not saying that it's evil to be rich or to be wealthy. But if you are really well off in this life and in this world, sometimes we begin to feel like we don't have a need for God. For Jesus will later say how difficult it is for a rich man to enter into heaven. Now, the poor in spirit are people that recognize that they have a desperate need for God. In verse 4, blessed are those who mourn. It's tempting to think that this is referring to mourning over the loss of a loved one. But this isn't mourning over the loss of a loved one. This is referring to mourning over our own sin. As John Stott again says, it is one thing to be spiritually poor and acknowledge it. It is another to grieve and mourn over it. I know what my temptation is. Sometimes we're tempted to laugh off our sin. Like, everybody does that. We get a little lighthearted about it. But maybe we can just ask the question, when was the last time that we mourned over the brokenness and the sinfulness of our own life. But I don't think this mourning is just referring to our own sin, though it certainly is focused on that. But it's also simply mourning over the sinfulness, the evil, and the brokenness of the world at large. When we look at the world and we recognize that all have sinned, what kingdom citizens do is they mourn over the brokenness of the world. Verse 5, blessed are the meek. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Here's another extremely countercultural statement. In a world that celebrates strong individuals, this flies in the face. We're called to be meek. It's not just countercultural. I would almost argue that it was completely foreign. Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones said, "The man who is truly meek is the one who is amazed that God and man think of him as well as they do and treat him as well as they do." See, we have a tendency to think that we deserve. They should treat me this way. And yet the meek person is one who is amazed that God and other people treat us as well as they do. Meekness promotes being gentle, humble, considerate, and courteous. Or again, as D.A. Carson says, meekness is a controlled desire to see others' interests advance ahead of one's own. And if I'm to get all cutesy, kingdom citizens are unique because they're meek. We're called to be meek. Verse 6, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. When we eat food, we're full, and if you're me or a teenage boy, an hour and a half later, you're hungry again. And you want to eat. You want to get your fill, and you eat. And then not much longer later, you want to eat again. But what Jesus says is that kingdom citizens have a different kind of hunger. And it's a hunger for righteousness, for doing the right thing, for being the people that God had originally intended, for the way that God had designed us, to honor God completely with our lives. Kingdom citizen has a different core desire than the world does. They hunger and they thirst for righteousness. Verse 7, blessed are the merciful. Blessed are the merciful, for they will see God. Grace is not getting what we deserve. Mercy is getting what we don't deserve. Grace is not getting what we deserve. Mercy is getting what we don't deserve. Mercy requires that we look at other people with compassion, even if they don't deserve it, because they're sinners just like you and I are. When you see people, we see a need, we see something that needs to be taken care of, and we have mercy on them by extending that mercy, that compassion towards them. And the reason, why are we to be merciful? Well, because so much mercy has been shown to us. Mark Moore says the reason a Christian can show mercy is because he or she understands how much mercy he or she has received. Who are we to withhold mercy? Who are we to withhold forgiveness when God has been so merciful to us? To not only withhold his wrath it deserves, but to give us life and life eternal. In a world that is unmerciful, merciful people stand out. Verse 8, blessed are the pure in heart. So if I'm to flip this the other way around and we're to look at the opposite of what the pure in heart are, we would be looking at the word hypocrite. A hypocrite was somebody in the first century that was a play actor. They would take a mask, they'd put a mask on, and on stage they would act like somebody that they're not. And sometimes they would play more than one part, and they would go off the stage, they'd put on a different mask, and they would literally pretend to be somebody that they're not. Someone that's pure in heart is absolutely sincere. They're the same person on Sunday morning as they are on Friday night. A person that's pure in heart is the same person in public life as they are in private life. And let me be clear on something. I want to make a distinction. We'll talk about this more in upcoming weeks. But a hypocrite is not somebody that never messes up. In fact, there aren't very many Christians that I've brushed shoulders with that screwed up, that weren't repentant of their sin, that admitted that they had done wrong. But a hypocrite is somebody that intentionally lives two separate lives. They may be somebody here on Sunday morning and completely different the rest of the week. For we all sin and fall short of the glory of God. Let's be careful not to call people a hypocrite simply because they're a sinner like you and me. Blessed are the pure in heart. The world needs to see the pure in heart that is unmixed with the ways of the world. Verse 9. Blessed are the peacemakers. This is not an instruction to be a person who desires peace. This is not an instruction to be a peaceful person. This is more than that. This is a call to be somebody who intervenes in the conflict of life in order to become a peacemaker. It's not enough just to say, yeah, I want peace. But how is it that we are intervening in a divisive world? To be a bridge, to be a peacemaker. How attractive peacemakers are in the world that we live today. In a world that divides and divides and divides and creates larger chasms. How is it that we as the church are being peacemakers? And lastly, if there's any that are countercultural or completely ludicrous, this is the one. Blessed are the persecuted. John Stott says, persecution begins when there are two completely irreconcilable value systems. It's when you believe this and I believe this, and they're not compatible with one another, and as a result, one persecutes the other. And in the midst of this tension, and in the midst of these irreconcilable differences, these values, the Christian is not to fight like the ways of the world. The Christian is not to bite back. It's not to fight back. It's not to sulk like a child. Rather, I'm not saying this is easy, by the way. Rather, Jesus says, we're to rejoice and be glad. Because we may lose everything in this world, but we're going to inherit everything in the next. And when we live as people who don't bite back and people who don't sulk when we're persecuted, people see something unique about you, something different, something attractive. Just look at the different stories of people who have been martyred throughout the world and the people that come to faith watching a Christian face death. There's something different about them. Kingdom citizens are called to be unique. D.A. Carson says this final beatitude, blessed are the persecuted. This final beatitude does not say, blessed are those who are persecuted because they are objectionable. I didn't know what that word meant, so I had to look it up. Blessed are those who are persecuted because they are offensive or obnoxious. That's not what this says. And it also doesn't say because they rave like wild-eyed fanatics or because they pursue some religio-political cause. The blessing is restricted to those who suffer persecution because of righteousness. The pin in it? The believers described in this passage are those determined to live like Jesus at all costs. Now, if the point isn't clear just from pulling out the Beatitudes, kingdom citizens are to have a unique character within this world. They show God. They show a different way of living in a broken, selfish, and hurting world. But it's not just for our own benefit. There's a purpose, there's a reason. There is a king that we represent when we are living out this kingdom character. Jesus continues in verse 13. He says, you are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? Is it no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot? He says, you are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds. We could just put it in here, that they may see your kingdom character and glorify your Father in heaven. Jesus uses two common and required household commodities for the first century to describe what his kingdom citizens are like. First, he says, you're like salt. I've always thought I was a little salty. He calls us salt. What was the purpose of salt in the first century? Primarily what the salt was used for was to keep food preserved, to keep it good. In an age that didn't have refrigeration or electricity, salt is what kept the food good. And of course, we all know what salt does is it flavors. It gives flavor. And secondarily, Jesus says, you are the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hidden. We are to shine our light so that our good deeds, our kingdom character may be seen for all to see. But here's the problem that I've seen, and quite frankly, that I probably have participated in myself, is sometimes our churches become salt shakers, but they don't shake. For salt has to be applied to food in order for it to be effective. And light has to be applied to the darkness for it to be of any use. Which comes to our second point. A kingdom citizen is to have kingdom influence. Salt doesn't do any good if it remains in the salt shaker. It's like Sarah saying, hey, can you salt my food? And passes me the salt and just sits there. And I eat it and I complain that my food's not salty. The salt has to leave the salt shaker in order to have any effect. In the same way, have you ever taken a flashlight and used it in a lit room? It doesn't do any good. It has to be amongst the darkness. Someone once said, Christianity that stops at the church exit door isn't much of use to anyone. Salt has to leave the salt shaker because the world decays like meat and like fish. But the church has the privilege of hindering that decay because our King is not of this world. Mark Moore continues to press a little further when he says this. Jesus was the light to the nations. The church is to continue to be the light of the world. It simply will not do to hide our personal responsibility behind an illumined church sign or to tuck it away in an organizational structure. Each Christian is called to move into the world and to live in such a distinctly different way that the unredeemed person can catch a glimpse of God. This is what we are called to. We must have kingdom influence by exercising our kingdom character within the world. But this is tough stuff. How do we do that? We've already admitted that we can read Matthew 5, 6, and 7, and every time we read it, we are attracted to it, and yet we realize every time that we fall short. And I don't think it's by any accident that Jesus gives us the solution at the end of this sermon. You'll find it in Matthew 7, or you'll also find it in Luke chapter 6, which is what I want to look at here. Luke chapter 6, verses 46 through 49. Jesus gives us a solution. Here it is. Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and not do what I say? As for everyone who comes to me and hears my words and puts them into practice, I will show you what they are like. They are like a man building a house who dug down deep and laid the foundation on rock. When a flood came, the torrent struck that house, but could not shake it because it was well built. But the one who hears my words and does not put them into practice is like a man who built a house on the ground without a foundation. The moment the torrent struck that house, it collapsed. It collapsed, and its destruction was complete. Back in 2011, there was a tornado that struck Joplin, Missouri. Sarah and I had left town 3 days prior. It was an F5 tornado. That's not a picture of it. It was an F5 tornado, leveled everything. The next day, we got to go and we got to check it out. There were houses completely off foundations. There were houses that were not even close to their foundations. There were some foundations that were ruined. But there was one teacher within the Bible college, within the Ozark Christian College that I attended, whose house was also destroyed. And while I'm not over-spiritualizing this, I think there was a great image that was seen with his house. For you can see there what these houses destroyed were. I mean, there was literally nothing standing, except for maybe a few walls here and there. And this teacher had one wall that was standing, one wall left in his house that was standing. And not only was the wall still standing, but there was a picture still hanging on the wall. And ironically, it was this one. I don't know if you've seen this painting before, but it's a beautiful painting it's got a storm raging in the background, it's got waterfalls falling, and right in the midst of the storm, there's a peaceful dove just resting away. And what an image that can give us as kingdom citizens when we're living out our unique character, when we're striving to live out that unique character within a dark and eroding world, when we're living as kingdom citizens that's completely countercultural and even foreign, that when the storms come, our lives will stand firm. And when the storms come, and other people's lives are crashing all around us, guess whose lives they're going to see that's standing strong? It's going to be those who have built their life upon the rock, which is our third point. A kingdom citizen is absolutely committed to the king of that kingdom. Dallas Willard says this: the Sermon on the Mount is not a set of principles to be obeyed apart from identification with Jesus. The Sermon on the Mount is a statement of the life we will live when the Holy Spirit is getting his way with us. John Stott said the Sermon on the Mount is probably the best known part of the teaching of Jesus, though arguably it is the least understood and is certainly the least obeyed. It is his own description of what he wanted his followers to be like. How do we become the kingdom citizens that we are called to be? We drop to our knees before the king. And he's a good king. And he's a gracious king. Because he's a king who is merciful. He's a king who fully relied on the Father. He's a king that demonstrated mercy and compassion. He was called the Prince of Peace, a peacemaker. And though he was persecuted and killed, he paved a way for each and every one of us. Though he was killed and though he was persecuted, he was lifted up, demonstrating that he has power over sin and death, demonstrating that he is truly the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, and truly the Prince of Peace. And our role is to be completely committed to that King. That's the King that we follow. That's the King that we serve. And his kingdom is not of this world, but of another world. Luke 6:47, right at the beginning, if you caught it, Jesus says this, says, everyone who, number one, comes to me. Number two, As for everyone who comes to me and hears my words, and third, puts them into practice. How do we first? We come to the King. We listen to the King. And we obey the King, and his Spirit is at work within us to transform us more and more into the image of his Son, Jesus. Kingdom citizens are of unique character. They're of kingdom influence, and they're committed to the King. But we're not called to do this by ourselves. Right in the passage that we saw in Matthew chapter 5, this isn't about individual citizens. This is about a kingdom. What did Jesus say? You are the light of the world. Individuals on a hill cannot be hidden. No, Jesus said, you are the light of the world. A town, a city on a hill cannot be hidden. Individuals don't make towns. Collective individuals who have come to the King of the kingdom do. And when we become the kingdom citizens, and as a result, the kingdom here on earth as it is in heaven that we're called to be, Jackson and the surrounding communities are going to see the kingdom at work. And they're going to glorify God in heaven. They're going to see a city built on a hill, and as a result, see the unshakable King in an unshakable kingdom. Come to the King, listen to the King, and obey the King.